Today I want to show an example of how we can use Angular's require mechanism in order to make our components communication much clearer and easier to maintain. Looking here, we have a simple example of an inbox kind of app. This whole screen is actually an inbox component that has these buttons and the mails themselves. Each mail is an instance of the mail component. If you look here, you'll see we have some sort of selection model. We can either have a single selected mail, or we can go into multi-selection mode. That's about it. Pretty simple. Let's take a quick look at the code as it is right now. First, we have this inbox component. You can see this template basically has the two upper buttons and then a simple ng repeat that goes over every email and shows it using the mail component. The API here between the inbox and the mail component is rather complex. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different bindings passed to the mail component. And the inbox component has to provide a dip enrich API. We have the option to tell the inbox to select only the current email. We have the option to tell it to toggle the multi-select on a given email. And because the mail component needs to know how to render itself, it also needs to know whether it is currently single selected or multi-selected. That's about it. And let's take a look at the mail component. This one is rather simple. It has a very straightforward template, which basically calls back to the inbox component using bindings whenever we click on the mail line itself, like here, in order to invoke single selection, or whenever we click on the checkbox, it will tell it to go into multi-selection. Easy as pie. Now, if I'd see this in one of my client's code bases, I wouldn't necessarily say this is bad. It's not bad. It's actually quite okay. But we do have an option to make things clearer here. Let's see why. Personally, I don't really like the way expression bindings work in Angular. Expression bindings are these. When you pass a function in a binding using the ampersand. Why don't I like them? I don't like the fact that we have an implicit API between the component and its parent component. Look, let's say I now want to use the mail component in a new component. I look at the binding and say, okay, it needs a select only binding. Great. It's not enough to just go into our inbox component and just pass select only in a function. There's a name here for the argument, and I have to know the name mail component expects to use. Why? The name I put here also has to be used when calling me, like you can see here. Every time you use an expression binding in Angular, you can't simply call the function that you were given with arguments. You have to wrap it up in an object where every argument is named like it was named by the caller in the expression. If we use the word mail here, we have to use the word mail here, and in toggle multi-select we use mail and selected, and so we have to use here in toggle multi-select mail and selected. I don't like this because it means that whenever you want to use the mail component and see its bindings, you have to go and look at its code or its template in order to find how it's going to call the binding, which names it's going to use, and then use those names in your expression. Personally, I think Angular maybe should have just put it here in the syntax. Maybe it should have been mail and mail selected, something like this. But since it's not the way, whenever it makes sense to not use expression bindings, I won't use them. Don't get me wrong, I use them every day because they're a big part of Angular. But if there's another possibility, I'll look into it. And here we do have another possibility, because mail and inbox components are always going to be used together, as opposed to some generic directives such as, I don't know, ng-click or ng-checked, etc. These two go hand in hand. And in those situations, you can use require. In case you don't know, require is an old capability of Angular that lets a directive or a component get access to a sibling or parent controller. What does it mean? For example, here on this input, we have two directives, ng-checked and ng-clicked. Technically, each one of them can require the other's controller, and so they can talk with each other. And that's a big part of how Angular's forms work. Every input that has an ng model can then require the parent form controller. And so all of the inputs you have in your form can register to the bigger form controller, and that's how validation works. That's how the big form knows about every input it's got inside it, and that's how it tells them to reset themselves, etc. Here we can make use of require in order to make the bindings nicer to maintain. Let's take a look at what it actually means. In our component definition, we'll add a require block. And we'll say we require the inbox control. The name I use here doesn't matter. It's just the name that I want to use the inbox control as. I could have just named it foo, but I'd rather just name it as something that has the original component's name inside it, so it will be easier to understand what's going on. And then we tell Angular to require that controller. The way we do it is we put in the name of the components whose controller we want, but since here we want a parent controller, okay, it's not the controller that exists on the element of the mail component, it's something we have in our parent, we have to add these guys. I know it looks weird, trust me, you have to do it this way, okay? When we work with directives, it makes more sense to have these options and non-caret options, etc. It doesn't matter right now. When used in components, you basically always need these two. And now, what this means is whenever inside our code we want to access something from these bindings, we can simply just call the inbox control directly. Okay, so first let's get rid of these because we no longer need them. And now let's go over the code, and whenever we access something that sits inside inbox control, let's just access it directly. Okay, first here, select only is now in inbox control. And now, how fun, we can call it like a regular function. We don't need to use the weird expression binding syntax. Same goes here. Inbox control is multi-selected, and we just call it. We found all the shenanigans. And inside our code, let's take another look. Same goes here. Is multi-selected, sits there as well. We can make this shorter. And we can make this shorter. Okay, and almost done. We have this guy. And we have this guy. Now all the ways in which we are calling the bindings are just simply using regular functions. Much clearer. We also need to update the inbox component, of course. First of all, we no longer need to pass these, right? They're not used any longer. We can make this a single liner. And I believe that's about it. Let's cross our fingers as I refresh. Yep, everything is still working. Awesome. So, what did we do? Let's take another last look at the code as it is right now. Inside our inbox component, basically things are simpler because we now only have a single binding for the mail component wherein we pass just what you'd expect it to see as an input. And inside the mail component, we now use require in order to access everything in inbox control. What I like about this is now you can look at the code and it's pretty easy to tell which calls are made to a binding or to another controller. It means that when you're refactoring, it's easy to tell right when you're looking at the template, even when in your real code where templates actually sit in a different file, it's easy to see which function you're calling or property you're accessing is actually in a different scope. And it also means that we get a little bit of safety, because if you ever try to use a mail component without being encompassed in an inbox component, you'll get an error from Angular saying this is required. So the explicitness of them having to go hand in hand is achieved, and the interface is cleaner. We no longer need to use the weird expression syntax. We can just use regular functions, and everything is way cleaner. As you can see, we've made the code a lot shorter. That's it for today. To sum it all up, when you have a suite of components that always go together, consider require. It just might make things simpler for you. And also, just because I'm saying it's possible, it doesn't mean you always need to use require. You don't usually work on suites of components, but just sometimes it makes things a lot clearer. Thanks for watching.